In the pantheon of fictional universes, few are as rife with memorable characters as Star Wars. From Admiral Ackbar to Yoda, the galaxy far, far away has served as a host to all manner of unique and iconic personas throughout its history. Some so much so that they've managed to carry entire video games by themselves. When the clone troopers debuted during the prequel trilogy, most assumed that they would never be given the opportunity to share the same spotlight. A genetically uniform army that served the Jedi prior to their downfall, the clones would largely function as background dressing to more important characters and conflicts in whatever fiction they made an appearance, lacking the presence or personality to carry most scenes on their own. However, it would be a squad of clones that would go on to feature in one of the most celebrated Star Wars games of the sixth console generation, Star Wars Republic Commando. A tactical first-person shooter set between the film's second and third episodes, Republic Commando not only provides players with an engaging gameplay experience, but gives distinct and endearing personalities to its unusual protagonists years before the Clone Wars TV show would attempt to do the same. It demonstrated that even without most of the franchise's main stalwarts, the Jedi, the Sith, and everyone in between, one could still create a Star Wars experience capable of reaching fans' hearts. This is the history of Star Wars Republic Commando. When one thinks of Star Wars video game developers, few stick out as prominently as LucasArts. Despite no longer developing any games of its own, the George Lucas-founded studio remains synonymous with the countless number of Star Wars games it helped usher into the world during its years of operation. Yet when it first started making games in 1982, the Star Wars universe was beyond its reach. Atari, which helped fund the studio's creation, had obtained an exclusive license to develop Star Wars games, forcing LucasArts to make a name for itself with original properties like Ballblazer and Maniac Mansion for the first decade of its existence. And after the license finally found its way into the studio's hands in the early 1990s, LucasArts made a point of not dedicating its entire existence to it, putting out Star Wars games like TIE Fighter and original games like Day of the Tentacle in nearly equal measure. Because there were no new Star Wars films that needed to be promoted in the early to mid-1990s, the Star Wars games released during this time tended to be personality-driven projects motivated by creative people within the studio wanting to try new and interesting things with George Lucas's universe, rather than by a need to check specific boxes. Once the Star Wars prequels began percolating at Lucasfilm, however, things quickly changed. The studio's creative releases all but died out, and LucasArts executives became increasingly obsessed with making sure it had a Star Wars game that would appeal to every subset of gamer, putting pressure on its staff to make titles in as many genres and styles as possible. While this shift paved the way for some well-received games that could never have been previously anticipated, like Star Wars Episode I Racer, it would also result in many mediocre ones, causing LucasArts' reputation to gradually dwindle. As LucasArts waded into the 2000s, the studio's situation would only become more and more precarious. Its staff continued to develop enjoyable titles like the Star Wars Starfighter games, and many of the third parties that it had licensed the franchise out to, like Factor 5 and BioWare, were producing impressive experiences of their own. Nonetheless, LucasArts' continuous decline in quality, as well as its over-reliance on the Star Wars brand, left many fans feeling soured. It's during this period that the team responsible for the Starfighter games began conceptualizing what would become Republic Commando. After working for years within the lighthearted and whimsical confines of the prequel trilogy, the team wanted to create something dark and unconventional, something that would explore the Star Wars universe through a radically different lens than previous games in the franchise. The team had also become engrossed in tactical first-person shooters such as Rainbow Six and Ghost Recon, which were surging in popularity at this time, and wanted to see if they could create a Star Wars game that encapsulated their sense of lethality and tension. One thing led to another, and the team settled on making a tactical shooter centered on a squad of clone troopers. In a 2005 developer diary on GameSpot, Tim Longo, the game's director, would explain that while military forces are always fueling the fire of conflict in the background of every Star Wars saga, said forces are rarely ever brought to the forefront. The clones, which had just been introduced in Star Wars Episode II, represented a hot new commodity through which they could explore this aspect of the universe, as well as the perfect force to craft a tactical experience around. It was a promising concept, yet executing it would be fraught with many challenges and frustrations.
Is it just me, or are we getting less and less intelligence in these briefings?
Stow it, 07.
Early on in the game's development, for example, the team had to figure out how to make a tactical first-person shooter that would appeal to their specific audience. Unlike Rainbow Six or Ghost Recon, which spoke to fans of strategic first-person shooters, Republic Commando needed to speak first and foremost to fans of Star Wars, as the latter fan base wouldn't tolerate tactical games' emphasis on micromanagement as much as the former. After some experimentation, the team would address this problem by creating a system in which the player could control their squad in a highly streamlined fashion. Rather than being able to issue a large and diverse set of commands at any given time, the player could quickly give broad directives for how they wanted their squad to behave, and issue more precise orders, like asking a trooper to breach a door or hack a computer by pressing a single context-sensitive button.
Okay, everyone, they know we're coming, so let's do this hard and loud.
Then, when Republic Commando entered the latter stages of its development, the team would be forced to completely rework the game's narrative and characters at George Lucas's behest. As revealed in a series of live streams hosted in 2015 by the game's lead programmer Brett Deauville, George Lucas would take issue with the clones the player controlled after trying out a late build of the game, criticizing them for being bland, overly serious, and hard to distinguish from one another. That the clones were nigh identical was not a result of the team responsible for them being creatively bankrupt. They just wanted to make sure that their depiction of the troopers didn't stray too far from that of Lucas. And at this point in time, the only major piece of media that showed his portrayal of them was Star Wars Episode II, where they appeared uniformly stoic and emotionless. Despite this, Lucas instructed the team to give each member of the squad distinct voices and personalities, a directive that many of the game's staff would agree was the right call in retrospect, but was immensely disruptive when it was issued. Finally, while all of these changes were taking place, the team was dealing with a work environment that was constantly shifting underneath their feet and didn't always share their excitement. As a result of LucasArts' flailing financials, the studio appointed Jim Ward as their new president in early 2004, who quickly proceeded to cancel various projects that were in the middle of their production, and began to extensively restructure the company from the inside out. While Ward spared Republic Commando, he repeatedly made it clear that he didn't understand its appeal, expressing greater interest in the iconic character-laden Star Wars Battlefront II, which was in development at the same time at Pandemic Studios. And due to the restructuring, almost everyone who was working on the game would find themselves laid off from the studio as it entered its final stretch, with every new milestone passed resulting in a new batch of employees being made redundant. Yet the team would persevere, guiding Republic Commando through hardship after hardship until it was finally released on the PC and Xbox in the spring of 2005.
You will be superior to your more common brethren, for you are a commando, an elite unit, something truly special.
Taking place shortly after the events of Star Wars Episode II, Republic Commando sees the player control Delta Squad, a team of elite clone commandos, in a series of campaigns against the forces of the Separatists facing them on Geonosis, a derelict assault ship, and the Wookiee homeworld of Kashyyyk over the course of several years. Delta's members, which include Scorch, Fixer, Sev, and the player-controlled boss, each possess distinct personalities and areas of expertise, yet they are all uniformly effective at raising hell for their enemies in a variety of different ways, with the player able to direct their brothers-in-arms' specific actions using the aforementioned contextual commands. This level of control also extends to when they run out of health, with the player able to choose whether to have other squad members revive them or leave them be until a more opportune moment presents itself. Additionally, as is typical of first-person shooters, the player gains access to a host of weapons that help further expand their options in every combat scenario by either reconfiguring the DC-17M blaster they start with or picking up the firearms of their fallen enemies. Republic Commando's critical reception would be largely positive, with pundits almost universally praising how entertaining each member of Delta Squad was to interact with, as well as how intuitive they were to command. What the game lacked in complexity compared to some of its peers, it more than made up for with the ease and satisfaction of executing tactical maneuvers alongside Delta Squad, even when the going occasionally got overly tough. And despite the fact that Republic Commando, true to its creator's intentions, featured a grittier Jedi-less take on its source material, it still felt right at home in the Star Wars universe.
An elegant weapon for a more civilized time, huh? Well, guess what? Times have changed.
The one area that most agreed Republic Commando wasn't all that it could have been was its multiplayer suite. Featuring a small collection of competitive modes commonly seen in other shooters at the time, like Deathmatch and Capture the Flag, most found its multiplayer to not be as fleshed out or tactical in experience as it could have been, with Brett Douville later revealing in a 2018 interview with PC Games N that it had been included largely due to market forces. It was also disappointing that the game didn't allow players to enjoy its campaign cooperatively, a feature that had been thought of during the game's development, but was ultimately dropped when it was assessed that the team lacked the time to implement it. More disappointing than the game's faults, however, would be its sales figures post-release. While far from a flop, Republic Commando would fail to garner the same level of support as previous LucasArts titles, with Pandemic Studios' Star Wars Battlefront II releasing in October of the same year to much greater commercial acclaim. Douville would blame this disparity on Republic Commando's lack of promotion, claiming that Jim Ward's lack of enthusiasm for it compared to Battlefront II resulted in it receiving much less of a marketing push than it ultimately should have received. After Battlefront II, LucasArts' next major Star Wars title would be 2008's Star Wars: The Force Unleashed, an action-adventure game centered on the exploits of Starkiller, a secret apprentice of Darth Vader. The Force Unleashed would receive positive reviews, yet ultimately failed to inspire the same reverence as LucasArts' previous titles. While The Force Unleashed was much more in line with what people like Jim Ward wanted LucasArts to focus on creating, giant, tentpole releases that featured plenty of brand-name characters, its gameplay lacked the level of polish that fans had come to expect from the studio, polish that games like Republic Commando had possessed in greater measure. And its sequel, 2010's The Force Unleashed 2, wouldn't fare much better. In the years that would follow, LucasArts would be characterized by disappointment and dysfunction, with the studio attempting vainly to get a host of promising Star Wars projects off the ground as it slowly collapsed for mismanagement. Finally, after a brief burst of hope upon the studio's reveal of the Uncharted-esque Star Wars 1313, it was announced in April of 2013 that LucasArts would cease to function as a video game developer. 1313 was canceled, and the majority of LucasArts staff were laid off, with only a skeleton crew remaining so that it could still function as a licensor. In its place, EA was selected to continue making Star Wars video games, with the company receiving the license to exclusively develop them for the next 10 years. While many within LucasArts remained fond of Republic Commando prior to the studio's de facto closure, no significant attempts would be made during this time to follow it up, aside from a simplistic mobile game released in August of 2005 called Republic Commando Order 66. A few ideas as to what the ephemeral sequel could entail were briefly discussed towards the end of the first game's production, with Douville revealing in his 2015 live streams that the team had two competing pitches as to where they wanted its story to go. The first one involved Delta Squad carrying out Order 66, in what would have been a much different manner than what was depicted in the mobile game, while the second involved Sev establishing the Rebel Alliance, training its forces from the ground up so that they can take on the nascent Empire together. Aside from a smattering of design documents and concept art, however, work on the sequel never went much further than these preliminary stages, as most of Republic Commando's developers had been laid off from LucasArts following its restructuring. Beginning work on such a project was unfeasible. That the game had also not been a massive commercial success didn't help matters. Despite this, Delta Squad's adventures would still continue through books, short stories, and comics in the years following Republic Commando's release, with the novels, which were penned by science fiction author Karen Traviss, Introducing Omega Squad, a second Commando unit that operated concurrently to Delta. And while both Republic Commando and these various offshoots would ultimately be rendered non-canonical in 2014, when Lucasfilm announced that almost all stories set within Star Wars' expanded universe were no longer considered part of the franchise's continuity, Delta Squad itself still exists within Star Wars canon, as a result of having briefly appeared in the Clone Wars TV show in 2011.
Can you die later, sir? It just isn't a good time now.
With EA having repeatedly expressed skepticism at the viability of linear, single-player-only Star Wars titles, it remains unlikely that players will receive a sequel to Republic Commando from the publisher anytime soon, let alone anything with a similar style or tone to it. But even if it's forced to stand by itself for the rest of its existence, Republic Commando will continue to stand tall. While aspects of its graphics and gameplay are dated by today's standards, the prequel-era first-person shooter remains both enjoyable to play and a poignant reminder that not all video games set in the iconic universe need to feature its most recognizable characters or locales. That sometimes, in a franchise as expansive and tradition-bound as Star Wars, one needs to be different in order to make something truly beloved.
Sorry, Deltas. Looks like it's back to the action. You have your orders.
Delta Squad, lock and load.
Our documentaries are crowdfunded and made possible by the generous supporters backing us on Patreon. If you enjoy our content, consider subscribing to our channel and becoming a patron to help us create more. Thank you.
With all due respect, sir, what's the holdup here?